Hello and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez.
Today we have with us Azby Brown. He's a native of New Orleans and has lived in Japan since 1985. He is an expert on Japanese architecture, design, and environment. His books include The Genius of Japanese Carpentry, Small Spaces, The Japanese Dream House, The Very Small Home, and his latest book, which is just released, which we are going to talk about today, is Just Enough: Lessons from Japan for Sustainable Living, Architecture, and Design. So, welcome, Azby.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Now, before we dive in, I do have a personal question, if it's okay. I want to know, how did you get that awesome name, Azby?
Well, I'm from New Orleans, and my family's been there for generations, actually 18th century. And one of my old French ancestors invented it. Before the Civil War. It's actually an alphabet game. A, Z, first letter, last letter. B, second letter. Y, second and last letter. And there's legends that were passed down that he was, involved with a court case, and there were evidence tags with these alphabet, letters on them, and he was playing with them and came up with the AZBY and said, that sounds like a name. Maybe that's the reason, but it's been sort of handed down through the generations, and if you ever meet anyone who has a name, they're very likely related to me.
That is such a great story. Wish I had such a nice one for my own name. Although my full name was my great-grandmother's, so I do, like that part. But
yeah, it's nice to kind of have things passed down. But the other thing I'll say, in full disclosure, my full name is Sidney Azby Brown. And this is typical in the South and other parts where people go by their middle name. So I was named for a great uncle who was Sidney Azby Stewart, and they called him Azby. So they called me Azby. So it's just, one of those, family culture, family tradition things.
Well, it's especially great, too, because your last name is Brown. So surely your parents didn't want to name you John, Steve, or something like that, which there would be, millions of others probably.
That may be part of it.
So the one and truly Azby Brown is with us today on the Books on Asia podcast. And I'm so excited to talk about your new book, your new old book, which has just been reissued by Stonebridge Press. And I have to say that I underlined so much in this book. It was so fascinating. And one of the fascinating things to me was that if you go to countryside Japan, you still see quite a bit of these Edo Period things. It's just that I never realized they were that old. And that is really exciting. Now, for those listeners who don't know about when exactly the Edo Period was, it was around 1603 to 1868. So about 150 years ago was the end of it. And when you think about it, 150 years isn't that long ago. And it seems to go back much further in history than even 150 years ago in the United States. Like, I know my own grandmother who died 30 years ago. She could drive, for example, right? And a lot of people, even in Japan, like where I live, anyone over 60 doesn't even drive. And so these traditions all go back to the way they lived, the houses where they walked everywhere, where everything was close by in the village, and they were almost self-sufficient. So before we get into all that, though, all that exciting stuff, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the journey of this book from when it was first published and to this new edition, and what you have changed in the new edition.
I'd be happy to. I've been in Japan for, over 30 years, 35, 36 years. I came in 1985, and specifically to study temple carpentry, so-called miyadaiku. And I spent 3 years researching the work of Tsunekazu Nishioka in Nara at Yakushiji Temple. He was really considered the last great Japanese temple carpenter. And I had noticed that when I would ask him questions, why do you do things this way? Why do you do things that way? Often his replies would circle back around to environment. Like, what was the environment this tree grew in? what was the surrounding environment like? What are the climatic conditions? What is it responding to? How will it change over a long period of time? And they're thinking in the span of 1,000 years. So that was interesting to sort of input that notion in my mind. And as I would spend time with other craftspeople, for instance, lacquer workers or others, often they had a very similar, rather deep environmental understanding, I felt, about the materials and about how things change. And fast forward, to, basically the 2000s, around 2005, I was asked to participate in a sustainability conference in the US. I had been writing about compact housing in Japan and looking at that as sort of small ecological footprint and some of those advantages. And in my discussions with that community, I realized that they were talking to each other about how their different spheres of work connected. Like the forestry people were talking to the watershed people, they were talking to the livestock people, they were talking to the agricultural people, they were talking to the energy people. They realized that everything they were doing was connected and were trying to find ways to, somehow interact and make use of that. And I got the sense there was so much interest in Japan and traditional ways, the indigenous culture and indigenous practices of Japan, that I thought, well, that's actually a really good subject to dive into. And I did. I dove in for about 5 years researching, and then wrote the book, and was published, I guess, 2010 by Kodansha International. And I have to say that was a great experience working with Kodansha International. Wonderful editor, Greg Starr, who I've worked with for years. And, we were able to print it on sustainable stock with sustainable ink. And it was just a great process altogether. I was very, very happy with it. But the company was closed. Kodansha International was closed like a year after the book was published, and folded. And Tuttle agreed to take over the title, which I was very happy about. And very simple process to just repurpose it. Made a new edition published in 2012, and very, very simple, very minor updates to that. And one of the big important points for me was that the March 2011 disaster had happened in the interim, and there was a lot of soul searching going on in Japan about the direction of the country, things that we had once understood about how to live well with the environment that we have forgotten, etc., including energy and those sort of things. And so I had written like a new preface to relate to that, and I was happy with that for a long time. And then last year, Tuttle said, we want to do a new edition, but we want to make some big changes. They wanted to put photographs in it and change the title. And I said, I don't really want to do that. And after discussing it for a while, I said, just let me have the rights back and I will see if I can find another publisher. And I talked, to Stonebridge, and they were immediately interested and started that process. And so the book has been, reissued. Again, the content is 90% the same. I went through to all of the sections after each section, farm, forest, city, etc. I have lessons, what we can apply, some of these ideas, how we can apply them today. And a lot of those had like statistics, how many % of the water is what, So I went through and checked and updated all that stuff. But by and large, the content is the same, with a new preface. So it's kind of a long journey, but I was mainly interested in just keeping it in print. And to me, it's very gratifying that after, more than 10 years, the book is still finding readership. And if anything, interest has increased over the past few years. I noticed this absolutely very clearly. Yeah.
You talk, and I know you've done speeches and there's YouTube videos and all about learning sustainability practices from Edo Period Japan. And I was wondering, how much of sustainability of the Edo times had to do with sumptuary laws and the scarcity of resources, and how much had to do with concern for the environment and living with nature? So was the Edo period Japan a Buddhist economy that values well-being over consumption?
Those are great questions. And the ultimate driver was the scarcity of resources, coupled with a fairly large population, which actually was growing and growing, until this period. And they managed to keep that stable. But it was basically the scarcity that drove it. And sumptuary laws, it's interesting because they have a dual purpose. One is, ostensibly they are to, maximize the use of resources or to minimize waste of scarce resources. But they also have sort of a social and political, motivation to make, keep people in their place. So sumptuary laws it's interesting because they often had to keep being reissued. The similar laws, they often weren't as effective as they were intended to be. But it was the scarcity and people's ingenuity in dealing with that, in finding ways to use what they had fully, finding ways to sort of socially, develop this value system that supported maximizing use and minimizing waste. And it wasn't designed. The key thing is that it was something that emerged through constant, years, centuries of interaction and incremental innovation and change. So, it's interesting, the whole preserving nature notion. I would say, yes, on the one hand, these values have persisted in Japan. There's a great, continuity through Shinto, through this notions of what is the place of the human being in this entire sphere, of everything that's been created, that humans are not the most important. And so much of Shinto is involved with maintaining balance and purity. The purification rituals often have to do with restoring balance. When things get out of whack, you restore the balance. So there is this notion that, humans have to take care of the environment and respect it. Similarly, in Buddhist thinking and certainly in Zen thinking, there is this notion of restraint, certainly in Zen. In Buddhism, a notion, again, that humans are not the most important, that everything living is precious, and we should preserve and respect that as well. So there is this value set, but this notion of nature that we, currently use and possess, I don't think really existed for Japanese at the time. I think it was probably a different conception of the world and how things interact. So,
and of course, then big business came along, didn't it?
Yeah, this is the thing. Like in your, at the beginning, you mentioned about, when was the Edo period, and it seems so long ago, when you look at the material culture of it, but it was not that long ago. And it's interesting because it was primarily pre-industrial. It's, before the Industrial Revolution arrived in Japan, which had already, been growing in the West for over a century prior to that. So it's interesting. We look at it as terms of, technological level. And one of the things I hope people understand is that this was a very advanced technological culture, which simply had different priorities than ours did in the West. And it wasn't about, commercial expansion at the cost of everything else. It was about, maintaining as good a quality of life for as many people as possible. And I think you ask, was this a Buddhist economy that values well-being over consumption? Well, in a way, the notion of governance, a very, very strong notion, was that good governance means taking care of as many people as possible, not maximizing the wealth and power of a small group. Of course, there were elites. It was the feudal system, but it wasn't about, having some people have a lot and everyone else doesn't have as much. There was a Confucian value to take care of people. And
it took away that competition as well then.
Certain kinds of competition. Of course, there was great competition among the merchant class, and there were competitions, between the daimyo of the feudal lords of different domains. But it replaced that with a lot more cooperation and coordination, I think, and that often depended on very, very good information flows and publication and literacy to help people understand what was going on.
Yes, that was one of the fantastic things I thought, was that they actually had these manuals of, like, for example, how to manage a forest or whatever it was, and these would get passed around and people would read them in different places. And
yeah, fantastic. That was also kind of a discovery for me. No-show, the farming manuals was one example that I used, and they did exist for just about everything. And they were these fabulously illustrated books, sort of step by step, how do you make a hoe? And how are the hoes for the, cucumbers different from the ones for the potatoes? And how to design these things. And again, it was a very literate society. Certainly most townspeople were literate. The samurai classes were literate, and even peasants, the farmers and others, there was a fairly high percentage. But those who couldn't read could, again, flip through the illustrations and say, oh yeah, I get it, and it was remarkable. And this was really a huge advantage for the society at the time to teach people how to do things and to motivate people to take steps that, could be beneficial overall.
And it seems like they were quite well researched. So they were, put together by people who knew what they were doing and had tried different things and, put together what worked best and decided to pass it on.
Yeah, it must have been a great job, I think, at the time to be like the researcher, in probably samurai class, okay, you're going to go research, how to grow cotton. And then take a trip, and they travel around and they get information, and they have drawings and, reams of notes, and they come back and they make a book out of it. And it gets beautifully published with woodblock prints, with illustrations. It must have been a very interesting job, and also depended on interaction and communication across the classes. So these were things that the samurai would not be able to do unless they had farmers and others who were willing to work with them and talk with them and teach them as well. So there was a lot of interaction here that made this sort of thing possible.
Speaking of interaction, it seems like your poodle's trying to talk to us in the background.
My poodle is guarding the entryway, and whenever someone passes by, and the next door neighbors have the gardeners over, so I think she's yapping again. Hope it's not too much of a problem.
It's always nice to have an animal on the podcast.
Yeah, she usually sits on my lap. She's really
sweet.
Nice little dogs, but yeah.
So getting back to like managing forests, so one of the things that was really interesting in your book, one of the many, many things, is that you brought up Kyoto and Nara, and all those ancient buildings that were made from wood. And especially if you take the modern Kyoto and you take out all the modern buildings and you imagine it as just this huge, temple site with all the trees and pathways, and you'd see how close all those temples really were to each other. But you said that they actually exhausted their first growth forests by making all those temples. And I imagine, the shrines came later, but the temples. And then, of course, because it's wood, they would, burn or whatever and have to be replaced. And I thought, wow, you really can exhaust a forest even back in those days.
Yeah, this was, one of the key drivers of, what developed into this very sustainable system during the Edo period was deforestation in the period prior. And it was not simply, the temples, but also you had 2 centuries of war. In Japan, lots of destruction, great building, castle building projects, building castle cities, building, ships, etc. It was a very expansive era, and Japan was actually, had colonial, projects to invade Korea, and was thinking about invading China, etc. And that sort of really fell apart and exhausted the nation in many, many ways, and including the forest. I mean, it was clear, the records are clear that people even wanting to build in the Kansai region would have to source timber from Tohoku, from Akita, and places that they had basically cut down those forests, and did not do it in a way that allowed the forests to restore well naturally. So one of the big steps, and this was where government guidance from, the central bakufu, from the leaders of the nation, where this was important, was to say, no, we have to prioritize everything goes back. Because you clear cut a forest. We see this now, in many places today. You cut a forest, cut it down, and if you don't restore that and with new growth, then you suffer landslides, and the rivers get silted up. If the rivers get silted up, then of course it's going to damage the fish there as well, but also may lead to unpredictable flooding. If you have unpredictable flooding, that could damage the agricultural fields. If you have that, then you may have famine. It's just, dominoes just collapsing. So they understood that. And this was clear, and issued guidance and recommendations. And one of the first things they did was a census. It took decades, but they counted all the trees. They checked all the forests. What's the health of the forest? What are the which trees are really in great shape that the government may want to use for their own projects? And which forests need to be closed for a period of time to allow them to regrow? And this is something called the Tomeyama. Closed forest. And it's actually, there were laws that prohibited people from even entering those forests with a cutting tool, with an axe or a big saw. The death penalty for entering with an axe, which seems really draconian. And I asked a specialist just earlier this year about that, and I said, was this penalty ever actually enacted? He says there's no record of anyone actually ever being executed for this, but the law was on the books to show how important the forests were. So it required a lot of steps. And then technically, How do they learn how to restore a forest and to establish the manpower and the systems and the oversight, which has to go over generations, 50 years basically, from when the trees are planted to when they're harvested? You need to have those social systems in place as well as the technical systems and everything else. So, and they did a great job, an exemplary job. There's a lot that we can learn from that.
And so was the Edo period time, was that a circular economy?
I would argue that it was. I would say that it is a very good prototype for what we today call the circular economy. And point out that, circular economy, this notion of circularity, has emerged really very clearly since, 2010, after really my book was published. There was some use of that term, but really after 2012, when the Ellen MacArthur Foundation issued some very, very excellent reports aimed at business, where it sort of was clear this was sort of a synthesis of many streams of thought, including the blue economy, including the cradle to cradle, including biomimicry, lots of things that had been, people have been promoting and thinking about. And as I mentioned at this conference on sustainability, people were linking up. And this was a wonderful linkage of these ideas into something that whoever came up with the term circularity, I'm not sure, but that is a great term. It's very easy for someone to understand what that means. So I would argue that Edo was circular without necessarily conceptualizing it that way. It was people throughout society maximizing the utility of what they have, often because there was a financial benefit for them to do that, often with some incentive, fairly light, a light touch from government to say, yeah, we want to promote this, but, not often, death penalty sort of thing, a lighter touch. But I'd say it's a great model for sustainability in general and circularity as well. I went through a few months ago, was asked by someone to sort of compare Edo to the SDGs, and I went through and checked off. I said, yeah, it pretty much was addressing almost all of them, with the notable exceptions of human rights issues and things like that, because it was a very different society. It was feudal society, and it was not an equal society in that sense. But basically, in terms of resource use and energy use and most of those principles, it was very, very closely aligned to that. So,
and speaking of SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and you would think Japan would have this great Edo period background to be able to more easily get back to doing things sustainably. So are there any places in Japan that are implementing a circular economy or attempting to do that? Towns, even small scale companies?
The short answer is yes. And I would point out it would have been great if this had started decades ago. We've lost a lot of time. One of the key issues for Japan, of course, is energy, dependent on fossil fuels and primarily imports, and nuclear energy played a big role. But we see with the Fukushima disaster, the hazards of that, and, had a lot of energy and focus been devoted to alternative sources of energy, maybe this wouldn't have been such an acute issue now. But it's great. I mean, you see that a lot of people are jumping on the bandwagon, and including government. Japanese government issued, was METI, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. They issued a report in 2020, what they call the, Circular Economy Vision 2020. And they're saying, yes, we're in on this. And they're trying to coordinate, focusing with industry, because so much of what needs to happen has to happen on the side of production and industry. And also with, consumer, habits as well. A lot of the more positive things we see tend to be on the municipal level, because that's, again, how Japan works. It's almost like Edo. The central government will say, let's do this, but it comes down to the prefectures and the municipalities actually do that. A great example is Kamikatsu, which is not that far from where you are, which I will admit to not having had a chance to visit yet. But they, back in 2003 or so, said, we're going to become the zero waste city. zero waste town. And they actually have done a great job of focusing their entire identity and getting people on board with this. So I think they have like an 80% recycle rate, and it's done very, very intelligently. Again, recycling things to use for biomass for energy, as well as, other things. They also focused this on the design side. There's an architect named Hiroshi Nakamura who built the Kamikatsu Zero Waste Center.
It's pretty amazing looking.
Have you been to it?
No, I've only seen the photos.
Yeah, well, I really want to go. Again, it's a bit far for me, so that's probably an excuse, but I really want to see it.
Too.
But the thing that's remarkable to me is that this has won awards. It's gotten a lot of attention, a lot of positive attention, in a way that I think can help shift people's values and what they're doing. So this is a great example. There are other smaller ones, like towns like Saga, which has, the big forestry industry. So they're looking at, how to use their forest resources in a circular way, and lots of companies and industries looking at things like single-use plastics. There's a company called TerraCycle, which is a U.S. Startup, which now has a lot of activity in Asia. And they're like working with manufacturers like Cow and others, the cosmetics and soap manufacturers and other manufacturers, beverage manufacturers, to try to get away from single-use plastics. And a lot of these things are pilot programs. We're still at the pilot program stage on a lot of this. But again, this is against the background of, on the other hand, a very strong and effective recycling of appliances and recovering materials from appliances. So the appliance industry, when you go to buy a new refrigerator, basically you're paying for that to be recycled when you buy it. And maybe you've done it, or other people have done it here. When you get a new one, they will cart off the old one and bring it to their recycling center, and they will take out all the materials and recover almost all the metals, for instance. And they're doing this very, very effectively, and they've been doing that for a long time. So there's a lot happening, and consciousness and awareness, though, may be still a few steps behind other countries like Europe or Germany or even China, like this awareness of circularity. This may be just the term, but I think we have like 30% awareness in Japan recently, based on one survey, where you have like maybe almost 60-70% in China, or 60% in Germany. So people are getting aware of it, but some other shift, I think, is probably needed in terms of people's awareness.
I agree, and certainly where I live, people aren't aware at all. However, on the other hand, they're not the ones who are really using the one-use plastic and such. Like, I was walking up to the temple with a woman the other day. We were doing temple cleanup, and she's an elderly lady, and she had these beautiful kasuri pants on. And I was like, "Oh, kasuri, that's a really nice weave." And she says, "Oh yes, I made them on the loom." So they're still, and we have these looms in a central place, and it's a bit of a novelty, but the women still like to do that because that's what they've always been doing. There are all kinds of things like that people still do the way they were, have been done for centuries.
Yeah. I think it is true. In the rural areas, you definitely see a much stronger continuity in a lot of ways with this, with exceptions. You'll see a big pachinko-ya, you'll see kombini, etc. in the
not where I live,
towns,
yes.
as well. But there is a greater continuity with the lifestyle and with the values as well. And I think there is this foundation, and I do find a fair amount of receptivity amongst Japanese people, organizations as well, to see if that can be a motivation. And the whole mottainai concept is one, waste not, want not. And I recall when I first came to Japan, I did a homestay in Tokyo with a family, and noticed that the mother, when she would come home from shopping, she would take all of the wrapping paper and sort of smooth it out, flatten it out, and keep it under her sink. She had this big stack of old wrapping paper. And I thought, I'm American, I'm going, why don't you just throw it away, And she said, "Oh no, I can use this. This I can use for getting the oil here. I can use this for that." She had a lot of use for that, but that was simply how she had been taught in her family growing up.
So we had to stop there for a moment because Azby's dog was barking, and so he decided to bring her in to do the podcast with him, which is awfully nice. She's a real cutie. She's a brown poodle. Is that what you're, just a poodle, or does she have a certain?
That's right, a little toy poodle.
Toy poodle.
Maybe teacup, but toy poodle.
Okay.
She's cute. Named Boo Boo.
Oh, Boo Boo. She seems much happier now.
Yeah, she wants attention.
Don't we all? So I wanted to ask you, since you're so into houses and the tiny houses and all that, I wanted to ask you about akiya, which are empty houses. And of course, with Japan's declining population, there are a lot of houses that are empty, and they're usually older houses, which might not be as convenient to live in anymore and would need a lot of work. But we just don't have the population here to have new occupants in them. So I was wondering if you have any ideas about what Japan as a whole could do with these houses to preserve them, or to turn them into businesses, or to offer incentives for people to move into them. You're in Yokohama, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and is there anything happening there?
In Yokohama, they've done a good job of repurposing and renovating older buildings for cultural spaces, to keep old banks or old warehouses and things, to renovate them. Things that would have maybe 30 or 40 years ago would have been demolished. Beginning really as far as 20 years ago, they started to see those as sort of cultural assets and have done a good job of that. But if I look at average neighborhoods in the akiya, like in my own neighborhood, I don't see any real effort to solve that problem. And as you pointed out, the fundamental problem is depopulation, coupled with inheritance taxes that make it very, very difficult for a lot of people to inherit an old building because they have to sell it to pay the taxes. And this is often more trouble than it's worth, and people end up losing money on that sort of thing. So I think any incentives need to really look at the entire picture of how are we going to live 50 years from now with a noticeably smaller population in our urban centers. Perhaps you're aware Tokyo is, estimated to lose half its population by the end of this century. It's remarkable. That means so much of the outskirts will sort of empty out. And it's already started to happen in places like Tama Newtown and other places. So how do we have planned depopulation and downsizing? And then when we look at housing stock, and we'd say that, most of these houses we're talking about are not necessarily attractive, 19th century or early 20th century houses. They are post-war buildings. They're not really attractive to most people. I do see also an increase in interesting architecture projects in the cities, in Tokyo, for instance, and also Yokohama, and I know some in Kansai, to reuse older buildings, older office buildings or older apartment buildings, etc., where this had been sort of a very marginal thing in the Japanese architecture world for a long time. In the past decade, and certainly since the 2011 disaster, I see renewed attention to this, and some of these buildings, again, winning awards. So this is one sort of attitude shift that I do see happening. The akiya banks are a great resource, sort of a great, let's say, invention. And, pretty much every town has one, or different regions will have them. And people who are looking for instance, old farmhouses, old kominka to restore, often are finding them through these akiya banks, which will have listings of available properties, and they're usually very, very inexpensive. So this has been a very helpful thing, but there's not a lot of consistency from place to place with how they operate and actually, the quality of information they have. I think it would be very beneficial if we saw an understanding that living neighborhoods are precious. That if there was an attitude amongst government and developers, for instance, akin to the Hippocratic oath that doctors take, that the first do no harm. If there was an understanding that, you don't want to demolish a neighborhood that's vital and is living, where people are living comfortably and in a positive way, even if it doesn't look so nice necessarily on a superficial level. And if that was coupled with this, drive of incentive to make it easy for people to move in at a low cost and take over these sorts of buildings, maybe for artist studios, certainly for shops, certainly for, let's say, supportive housing for people with disabilities or people who are unhoused or people who have other issues. There's a lot of things that happen in other parts of the world, in the United States and in Europe, that are very, very similar to this, which I don't see much interest in Japan yet.
Exactly. And it seems like the government, to me, could do a lot more. For example, even just encouraging people to have second homes because everyone basically has one, because their heritage home and their, hometown is there. A lot of them are empty. And I think people, they only think of going back to them, for Obon, to do their grave rituals and all that. But like where I live, it's an island and it's delightful. And it's surprising how, there are a few families that come back and they've got young kids, and it's exciting to go back to the home, the heritage home. The beach is here. They can swim. They can go boating. They can, do all sorts of things. But it's also amazing how many people don't do that. They're doing other things. They're going to Disneyland instead, for example, in Tokyo. So I feel like if there was a bit of a push to appreciate your heritage, and if there were incentives to fix up the old homes and such, I just feel like more could be done in that area. It's certainly done in other countries. My
perception is that, if people are allowed to, if there's not a lot of friction, let's say in terms of, cost or legal restrictions, et cetera, people will sort of do these things anyway. Just like how people take care of their neighborhoods. If you let people organize things the way they think suits them and reinforces their family bonds, their community bonds, then they sort of do this naturally. So I think a lot of it has to do with removing friction and obstructions to this. And a lot of this has to do also with aspirations. And this sort of ties into the whole sustainability and circularity issue in general, where people seem to think that doing these things means having a lower standard of living.
Exactly.
Or doing without things they want. And a lot of the persuasion, of groups like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been saying, no, that's not what it means. And the experience of Edo was clearly a constantly rising standard of living for almost everybody. So it's about aspirations, and these things are tied with notions of status, so you mentioned
True.
Disneyland. Of course, people go, I want to go to Disneyland. It's fun, and I can get all those, toys and the costumes and the funny ears, and bring back the, the boxes of sweets for everybody. And this is sort of a cultural thing, an aspiration, something people want to do. It's interesting. I mentioned Kamikatsu earlier, and things like that, projects like that get attention in a very positive way, help shape people's aspirations. And I think the more we have interesting examples done, whether it's urban, whether it's a town that makes old machiya, shop buildings available for new businesses, whether it's maybe food related or some craft related or something totally different, the more we see these examples, the more people understand how nice it can be. And I think, certainly in terms of the reuse of old buildings, that's one of them. There's been a shame factor, you see. One of the things that I'm from New Orleans, I mentioned, and, everyone lives in old houses there, basically. If you have a house that's like, 10 years old and one that's 100 years old and there's similar costs and similar size, almost everybody will pick the older house. It's a better house. It's nicer. It has a story. It's human. It has all sorts of, these sort of intangible human things that come with it.
That's right.
But in Japan, I was fascinated from the beginning why so few people want to live in an old house. What's the problem? And my mother-in-law, my Japanese mother-in-law at one point sort of alluded to ghosts, well, they have tamashi, they have ghosts, there's other things, but, No,
absolutely. It just doesn't have cachet at all.
It doesn't have cachet. And I think this sort of thing can change as we see better designs and, more innovative uses and more attractive uses. And people are changing. There is a great generational gap here, according to all of the data I'm looking at. Younger people are much more responsive to these ideas. Older people, especially the post-war generation, grew up in a very deprived economy. People who are in their 70s, 80s now, really, a lot of them were struggling and to survive, and were growing up in towns that were still full of empty lots because of the bombing from the war. So it's a very different
right. The history
something in
isn't
the heart, something in the heart about what they want and what's important. So, but it is changing. I do see it changing.
To me, the greatest thing about moving into an older house, I mean, everything else aside, all the wonderful things it can bring, is that you don't have to build a new one then. And all that energy doesn't have to be wasted that goes into building something new, which isn't going to last nearly as long as the old house in the way Japanese things are made.
Yes. This is a big principle, like in circularity, in terms of, let's say, construction and building, is that, yeah, it is very, much more resource intensive, much more carbon intensive to build something new, to demolish something, build something new. It can be mitigated if the older building materials are being reused in a good way, as they were in Edo, and throughout Japanese history, basically, you know, the buildings are made to be taken apart. You pull out the wedges, you know, you pull out the pegs, and everything can be recycled and reused. And there were lumber yards in Japan in this period that specialized in used timber, where you can go and get used wood to build your shed or your house or extension or whatever. There's an interesting movement now called Buildings as Material Banks, and there's actually an organization with this name and a website, which is promoting. Well, it's global and it's maybe just catching on. I'm trying to make people aware of it as much as I can. It's saying, let's, get rid of this idea that the building is the end use of materials and try to adopt a mindset where the building is simply a place where those materials are being stored for a certain period of time. And when the end of life of that structure comes, then the materials can go to another use. So it's like storage area for materials. And it's remarkable. And it's an engineering and design problem more than anything else. And lots of companies are designing new building materials or adapting materials so this can be done. Now, so it's a great idea. It's a wonderful idea. It's very Edo. This is how they did it, without being asked. When I've talked about this with like major, real estate companies, construction companies, they sort of grimace, it's like, because it would mean changing a lot of what they do. Steel, building materials, those things are very well recycled in Japan. And they're finding ways to like recycle concrete, to crumble it up and to use it, reuse it and stuff. So they're working on this stuff, but to make a radical shift like this changes all of their calculations and the way they've been doing things. So it's a big challenge. It's a difficult sell. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's, that's very interesting. Thank you so much for all this enlightenment. I just love it. And our last question, which I always ask our guests, is what are your 3 favorite books on Japan? Now, this can be fiction, nonfiction, for whatever reason. I would love to hear what you like to read.
That's such a great question. And there's so many new books coming out constantly that I want to read that I haven't read yet, or some that I have, that it's a great time for writing on Japan. But most of what I really refer to mentally and it stay with me are older things. And one is Zen in Japanese Culture by Suzuki Daisetsu.
Yep.
Which a friend in college told me about. And that is something that really affected me and sort of put me on the path to come to Japan. And that is a remarkable book. It's a bit dense, and it's from 1959 or so it's an older book, but that's a great.
It's a classic for sure.
It's a classic, definitely classic. Another classic that stays with me and I find myself referring to constantly is The Unknown Craftsman by Yanagi Soetsu.
I love that book.
Yeah. Just in terms of what are the values, what's the thinking, remarkable book. And I think the same translation from the 1970s is still being published. More recent, when people are going to come to Japan, they say, there's something I should read. One book I almost always recommend is Dogs and Demons by Alex Carr. which, talks about the problems. I mean, there are these underlying values and the beauty of Japan and this natural environment and all of this mindset of preserving that and honoring that. And then this massive machinery, social and economic machinery that pretty much is destroying the environment the whole time. That's a very interesting book. I recommend to people. So those would be the top three, but there's others. I mean, if we're talking about Alex Carr, Lost Japan, which is the opposite, is the wonderful, it's a sort of appealing to, traditions and these continuities in culture, In Praise of Shadows by Tanazaki, which again influenced me strongly in college. Inland Sea by Donald Ritchie. I mean, the list goes on and on. Maybe Inland Sea affected you. Maybe that had some reason for why you ended up there. But there's so many great books. And most of the ones that I really, really, refer to are classics.
So there it is, Azby Brown talking about sustainability in Edo, Japan, and what we can learn from it. His recently released book, be sure to pick up a copy of Just Enough, Lessons from Japan for Sustainable Living, Architecture, and Design. You'll also find him online. He has a website dedicated to the book at www.justenoughjapan.com. He also has his own personal website. He's a very multi-talented person. He's not only is he into architecture, but he is also into drawing, and he's done film work, and he's very creative. So be sure to check out his own personal website at azbybrown.com. He's also on LinkedIn and Twitter at azbyb. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Amy.
You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Amy Chavez and Michael Palmer, logo by Alex Kerr, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years. They can be found at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your podcast host, Amy Chavez, author of Amy's Guide to Best Behavior in Japan and The Widow, the Priest, and the Octopus Hunter, discovering a lost way of life on a secluded Japanese island. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.